The plate shattered against the far wall of the Langston farmhouse, and Dorothy Hart did not flinch. She stood in the doorway, mud-caked boots on the threshold, a cast-iron pot of beef stew steaming in her hands, and she watched Gideon Langston stare at the broken shards on the plank floor like he was seeing something no one else in the room could possibly see. His chest heaved. His jaw was locked so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath his bearded cheek. The farmhouse smelled like old ash and something worse, like a place that had stopped breathing months ago and simply hadn't had the courage to collapse yet. "Get out," Gideon said. His voice was low and flat, the way the Kansas sky got flat before a tornado touched down. Dorothy did not get out. She stepped over the threshold instead, set the pot on the warped kitchen table, and pulled 2 clay bowls from the burlap sack she carried over her shoulder. Her hands were steady. Her heart was a completely different matter, hammering against her ribs with a violence she had not expected when she'd agreed to this arrangement 3 weeks ago in the sheriff's office in Harlow Creek. "I said get out of my house," Gideon said again, louder now, turning to face her fully for the first time. The look in his eyes was the thing that nearly broke her resolve. It wasn't rage, though rage was threaded through it like a dark vein through pale stone. It was grief so raw it looked like an open wound, and Dorothy had spent enough years nursing the wounded to know that the ones who pushed hardest were the ones who needed the most tending. "I heard you," she said quietly. She ladled stew into both bowls. The steam rose between them like something living. "You haven't eaten a warm meal in I don't know how long. The children told me." That was the thing that cracked his armor. Not much, not all the way through. Just a hairline fracture, barely visible, but his shoulders dropped a 1/4 inch and she caught it. "My children had no business telling you anything," he said. "Your children are frightened," Dorothy said. "They're frightened and they're hungry, and your oldest girl is trying to cook on a fire she doesn't know how to tend properly, and she's 8 years old, Gideon." The use of his given name was a risk. She knew it. She watched his eyes go sharp with it. But she held her ground, because she understood something about men like Gideon Langston, men who had been broken open by loss and left standing in the wreckage of themselves. You did not tiptoe around men like that. You spoke plainly and you didn't look away, and you trusted that somewhere beneath the rubble, the man who had once built something worth loving still existed and was waiting, even if he didn't know it himself, to be found. She did not know yet that she would be the one who found him. She had not planned for any of this. She had planned for none of it at all. 6 weeks earlier, Dorothy Hart had been standing behind the counter of her late father's general store in Harlow Creek, Colorado, tallying a column of numbers that refused to add up to anything good, when Sheriff Aldous Prentice came through the door with his hat in his hand, and an expression she recognized as the one men wore when they were about to ask something they already knew was impossible. She was 26 years old. She was not beautiful in the way that stopped strangers in the street, but she was striking in the way that made people look twice. Dark auburn hair she kept pinned severely at her nape, gray eyes that saw more than was comfortable, hands roughened from a life that had required her to use them. She had grown up behind that counter, and she had run that store alone for 2 years since her father's heart had given out in the back storeroom on a Tuesday in October. She was not unhappy. That was the important thing she told herself, not unhappy. The sheriff set his hat on the counter and told her about Gideon Langston. He told her about the Langston farm, 300 acres of good land 4 miles east of town, a solid house built by Gideon's own hands, a proper barn, livestock, a creek running through the back 40 that never went dry. He told her about Clara Langston, who had been buried in the churchyard behind the First Methodist 8 months ago. Consumption, swift and merciless, leaving behind a husband and 3 children, Eliza, aged 8, Thomas, aged 6, and the baby, Ruth, who was not yet 2 and would not remember her mother at all. He told her that Gideon Langston had not come to town since the funeral, that he had sent his eldest in once to trade eggs for flour, and that the girl had been so visibly underfed that the pastor's wife had pressed a full basket of cornbread on her and wept about it for 3 days. Dorothy listened to all of this with her arms crossed and her expression carefully neutral. "What is it you're asking me, Aldous?" she said when the sheriff ran out of words. "I'm asking if you'd consider going out there," he said. "Not permanently, not anything improper. Just to look in on things, bring some provisions. The man's in a dark place, Dorothy. He's not tending to himself or to that farm, and those children are suffering for it." "I'm not a charity worker," she said. "No," the sheriff agreed. "But you're the most capable woman in this county, and you've got more compassion than you let on, and there isn't a soul in Harlow Creek who would do what needs doing as well as you could." She should have said no. Looking back at it later, she could see every moment where no had been the clear and obvious answer, where a sensible woman would have minded her own considerable business and stayed behind her counter. She said she would think about it. She thought about it for exactly one night, lying awake in the room above the store listening to the wind come down off the mountains, thinking about a little girl of 8 years old trying to keep a fire going and cook something edible for her younger siblings while her father sat in the dark of his grief and let the world outside himself go to ruin. She went the next morning. The farm was everything the sheriff had described, and the disrepair was worse than she had imagined. The fence posts along the east pasture had fallen over and not been reset, and the livestock, 2 horses, 4 cattle, a dozen chickens, were in a state that suggested someone had been doing the barest minimum to keep them alive and nothing more. The kitchen garden behind the house was a tangle of dead stalks and volunteer weeds. The porch railing had rotted through on one side, and someone, probably Eliza, had propped a stick against it as a warning. Dorothy had stood in the yard for a long moment, looking at all of it, feeling something settle into place in her chest that she could not quite name. It was not pity, exactly. It was something closer to recognition. She had knocked on the door. Eliza had answered it, small and solemn-faced, with Thomas peering around her hip and baby Ruth on her shoulder, heavy as a bag of flour. "Hello," Dorothy had said. "My name is Dorothy. I've brought provisions. May I come in?" Eliza had looked at her with the ancient, measuring gaze of a child who has been made old before her time. Then she stepped back and held the door open. That was how it began. She came every day for a week before she saw Gideon at all. He was in the barn during her first 3 visits, and she could hear him moving around in there. The thud of tools, the low sound of him speaking to the horses, but he did not come out. She cooked meals and left them, cleaned the kitchen, brought clean water from the creek, mended the porch railing, restocked the pantry shelves with what she'd brought from the store. She played with the children in the afternoons while the biscuits were in the oven. She showed Eliza how to bank a fire properly so it would last through the night. On the 4th day, she started mending the kitchen garden. On the 5th day, she started on the east fence. She was not sure what made her do it, except that the work was there, and her hands were capable, and she had never in her life been able to walk away from something fixable. She was setting a fence post on the 6th day when she heard boots on the hard ground behind her, and turned to find Gideon Langston standing 20 feet away, watching her with an expression that contained equal parts confusion and something that might have been outrage. He was not what she had expected, though she was not sure what she had expected. He was tall, well over 6 feet, broad through the shoulders, with the weathered look of a man who had spent his whole life outdoors. His dark hair was long past needing a cut, and his beard was several weeks unkempt, and there was a hollow look to him that went beyond the physical neglect, the look of a man who has stopped eating not because there is no food but because eating feels like a betrayal of something he can't name. He was 34 years old, she would later learn. He looked older. "What are you doing?" he said. "Fixing your fence," she said. "I can see that. I'm asking why." "Because it needed doing," she said, and turned back to the post. He stood there for what felt like a very long time. Then she heard him walk back toward the barn without another word. She took that as progress. On the 7th day, she arrived to find him sitting at the kitchen table with Eliza, who was showing him something in a picture book, one of the few the family had, a battered illustrated Bible that had clearly been loved to the point of coming apart. He looked up when Dorothy came through the door with her basket, and there was a moment between them, brief as a breath, where something passed across his face that she could not read and then was gone. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said back and went to the stove. That was the whole of it. 2 words. But they were the first words he had spoken to her that were not an order or a dismissal, and she held them carefully all the way home. On the 8th day, she found the house empty, the children gone, and Gideon sitting on the back porch steps staring out at the creek. She set her basket inside and came to stand at the bottom of the steps, and she asked where the children were. "Sent them to the pastor's for the afternoon," he said. "Thought we should talk." Her pulse did something she did not appreciate it doing. She sat on the step below him. She did not wait for an invitation and looked out at the creek the way he was looking and waited. "I'm not a charity case," he said. "I never thought you were." "Then what do you call what you've been doing? Coming here every day, cooking and mending and planting my garden." "I call it neighboring," she said. "People used to do it all the time. It's gone out of fashion, I suppose." A long pause. The creek moved. Something moved in the willow trees along its bank. "People have said things," he said, "about you coming here. People will say things regardless," she said. "I've never found that a compelling reason to stop doing what needs doing." Another pause, longer. Then, "You're a strange woman, Dorothy Hart." "I've been called worse," she said, and there the first time. A twitch at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, not yet, not nearly, but the ghost of a memory that smiling had once been something he knew how to do. It was enough. The sheriff had come to her that evening, and that was when things began to get complicated in ways she had not foreseen. Aldous Prentice was a good man and a good sheriff, but he was a man of his time and his place, which meant that the idea of Dorothy Hart spending her days alone at the Langston farm was beginning to produce the kind of community conversation that made him uncomfortable. He sat across from her at her kitchen table and said, with the careful diplomacy of a man who has rehearsed what he is about to say, that people were talking, that it was not seemly, that perhaps she ought to curtail her visits. Dorothy had looked at him steadily for a long moment. "The children are still struggling," she said. "Gideon is still in no condition to run that farm properly. If I stop coming, those children will be in real danger come winter." "I know that," the sheriff said. "But Dorothy, what would you have me do, Aldous? Leave them?" He'd sighed. He'd rubbed his face. "There are proper arrangements," he'd said carefully. "You mean marriage," she said flatly. He had the grace to look pained about it. "It would resolve the situation, legally and properly. You'd be there as his wife, and the children would be cared for, and people would have no cause to." "He has not asked me," she said. "He might," Aldous said, "if someone suggested it." She had told him to go home. She had sat at her table after he left and thought about the things she had not told him, that she was not looking for a husband, that she had watched her mother disappear into marriage like a ship going under water, and she had been wary of the institution ever since, that she had built something of her own in this store and this life, and she was not interested in surrendering it to anyone. She thought about all of that. And then, despite herself, she thought about the twitch at the corner of Gideon Langston's mouth, the ghost of a smile that had lived there for exactly 1 second before it was gone. She was still thinking about it when she finally fell asleep. 2 days later, Gideon came to the store. He came in the morning when the store was quiet, and he stood just inside the door for a moment like a man who has forgotten what stores are for, looking around at the shelves with a slightly stunned expression. He was cleaner than she had seen him, hair combed, beard trimmed, wearing a coat that still held its shape. Small steps. She noted them with the careful attention she gave to everything. "Good morning," she said from behind the counter. "What do you need?" He looked at her. "I need to talk to you," he said. She came around the counter and led him to the 2 chairs she kept near the window for customers who needed to sit. She sat in one. He sat in the other, turned his hat in his hands, and spent a long time looking at the floor. "Prentice came out to the farm," he said at last. She had suspected as much. "I see. He said the same things he apparently said to you." He glanced up. "He said you turned him down." "I told him it wasn't his business to arrange," she said. A long pause. He wasn't wrong about the situation, Gideon said. I'm not blind to what I've let happen, to the farm, to the children. Something went tight in his voice. It's been a dark time. I know, she said gently. I'm not asking for your pity, he said quickly. I know that too, she said. He looked at her steadily for a moment. His eyes, she noticed again, were a deep and complicated brown, full of things she suspected he had never said aloud to anyone. I'm going to say something and it's going to come out wrong, he said, because I don't have the words for it the right way, but I want you to know I mean it respectfully. Say it, she said. I think you should stay, he said, permanently, as my wife. And I want you to know I'm not saying it because of what people think or what Prentice said or any of that. I'm saying it because those children need you, and because I think the farm needs you, and I think he started again. I think I've been drowning and I didn't know it until you showed up and reminded me what air was. The store was very quiet. Outside, a wagon went by in the street. Dorothy looked at him for a long time, long enough that he shifted in his chair and she could see him steeling himself for rejection. I have conditions, she said. Something moved in his expression. Relief, maybe. Tell me. The store stays mine, she said. I keep the deed in my name, I keep the books, I keep my independence. He nodded. I am not your housekeeper, she said. I will cook and tend and care for those children because I want to, not because it is my duty. There is a difference and I need you to understand it. I understand it, he said. And you will talk to me, she said. I will not live alongside a ghost. I will not cook meals and tend a house for a man who is not present. If we do this, you have to be here, truly here. He absorbed this. The hat turned again in his hands. That's the hardest one, he said finally. I know, she said. I'm asking anyway. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but weighted, the way the air gets heavy before rain comes. All right, he said, then quietly, I'll do my best. She had reached across the narrow space between the chairs and put her hand briefly over his just for a moment, barely 3 seconds, before she pulled it back. His hand had been very still under hers, like a wild thing that does not want to startle. So will I, she said. They were married on a Saturday in November of 1878, in the Harlow Creek courthouse rather than the church, because Dorothy had said quietly that she would prefer something that felt like an agreement between two people rather than a performance for an audience, and Gideon had surprised her by agreeing without argument. The sheriff witnessed. The pastor's wife, who had a soft spot for the Langston children, insisted on baking a cake. The children were dressed in their best. Eliza held Ruth on her hip with the practiced ease of a child who had been doing it for 8 months, and Thomas stood very straight beside his father with an expression of careful solemnity that broke Dorothy's heart a little. Gideon said his vows in a low, steady voice looking directly at her, and she said hers back the same way. And when the brief ceremony was done, he looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, part gratitude, part something that was still locked behind walls she didn't yet have the keys to. She moved into the farmhouse that afternoon. The first weeks were careful and polite, and exhausting in a way she had not fully anticipated, because there is nothing in the world quite as tiring as being kind with tremendous intentionality to someone who is still partially living somewhere else in their own mind. Gideon was there, physically. He ate the meals she cooked, real meals, warm meals, the kind that took time and intention, and the first time she set a full supper on the table, and he sat down and ate 2 full portions of stew and cornbread without saying a word. She counted it as a victory as significant as anything she had ever done. She could see him fighting something. Every time he sat down to a meal she had made fighting the instinct that said that eating a warm meal cooked by a woman who wasn't Clara was a form of disloyalty. She saw it in the way he paused before the first bite, every single time, like he was having a private conversation with someone who wasn't in the room. She did not push. She was patient in the way that only people who genuinely believe in something can be patient, with the slow and steady patience of a woman who had spent years watching seedlings come up through frost-hardened ground and knew that forcing the process only broke things. But she watched. She paid attention. She learned him the way you learn difficult terrain, one careful step at a time. She learned that he woke before dawn without exception, and that the first thing he did was stand at the window of the bedroom and look east toward the place where the light would eventually come, and that he stood there for several minutes before he moved. She learned that he talked to the horses by name with more ease than he talked to people, that he was fiercely gentle with the children in ways that contradicted his closed-off exterior, that he fixed things, broken tools, loose shingles, cracked harnesses, with a precise and concentrated attention that was almost beautiful to watch, as though the act of mending physical objects was the only kind of mending he trusted himself to do. She learned that he had a habit of stopping sometimes in the middle of a task and simply standing still for a moment with his eyes closed, and that when he did this the look on his face was one of such private grief that she always looked away quickly so he would not feel observed. She learned that on the 8th of every month, Clara's birthday, she discovered later, he put wildflowers on the kitchen table without explanation, and the children never mentioned it either, as though it was a sacred and wordless ritual they all participated in together. She did not interfere with any of it. That was not who she was. She was not there to erase Clara Langston. She was not there to replace a ghost with herself. She was there to make sure the living things kept living. The children were easier, and the children were the key to everything, because Gideon watched her with them with the intensity of a man who is evaluating something of the highest importance, and what he saw slowly and methodically dismantled whatever resistance remained in him. She read to them every evening. She taught Eliza the actual principles of cooking rather than just the survival minimum, and Eliza proved to have a natural gift for it that made the lessons a genuine pleasure. She took Thomas out into the kitchen garden and showed him which plants were which and what they needed and why, and he followed her around asking questions with the relentless precision of a boy who would eventually be either a farmer or a scientist, and would be excellent at whichever he chose. She carried Ruth on her hip through the mornings with a comfort that surprised her, because she had not thought of herself as someone particularly suited to small children. But there was something about the weight and warmth of a baby who fit herself against your side like, she belongs there, that reorganized Dorothy's sense of what she wanted. One evening in late November, she was sitting near the fire mending one of Thomas's shirts when she realized Gideon was watching her from across the room. Not the measuring, evaluating look she had grown used to. Something different. Something she was not sure he was fully aware of himself. She kept her eyes on the mending. "Say what you're thinking," she said. A pause. "I'm not sure I know how to say it." "Try." Another pause, longer. Clara was, he stopped, started over. "We grew up knowing each other. There wasn't a time I can remember that she wasn't," he trailed off again. Dorothy waited. "I didn't know how to be without her," he said. "I'm not sure I understood until you came that being without her was different from being nothing." She looked up from the mending. He was looking at the fire. "There's a difference," she said carefully. "I know that now," he said. "I didn't for a while." "What changed?" He was quiet for a long time. Then, "You fixed a fence post that I had been walking past for 2 months without seeing it. And then the next day you fixed another one. And I thought she's going to fix the whole thing whether I like it or not. And then I thought." He stopped. "What did you think?" she asked. He finally looked at her. "I thought, what a thing. What an extraordinary thing to just keep doing." Dorothy felt something move in her chest, slow and deep, like a tide coming in. She looked back at her mending. "The fence needed doing," she said, her voice a little steadier than she felt. "I know," he said. "That's what I mean." December came down hard and cold from the mountains, and with it came the full press of winter work. The livestock needed more tending, the house needed more wood, and the shortening days had a quality of forced proximity that was, Dorothy found, either going to resolve the question of who she and Gideon were to each other or create a tension that made the whole arrangement impossible. It resolved. Slowly at first and then all at once, the way ice on a river breaks up in spring, you watch it hold for weeks and then one morning it simply goes. It began with small things. He started helping her with the dishes after supper, which she had not asked him to do and which seemed to embarrass him when she first noticed, as if he had been caught in something. She made no comment. She simply handed him the drying cloth. The second time it happened, she said, "Thank you." He nodded once, and that was the whole of it. He started asking her things. Not large things at first. Whether the Hendersons' root vegetable blight was likely to spread to their own garden, whether the smoke from the chimney had seemed thin lately to her too, whether she thought Thomas's cough was something to worry about. Small questions, practical questions, but questions, which meant he was thinking about her as someone whose opinion had weight. She started asking him things in return. About the farm, about what had worked in previous years, about the creek's behavior in heavy rain. He answered these fully and attentively, and she realized that he was a thoughtful and deliberate man, the kind who thought through things carefully before speaking, and that a great deal of what had seemed like silence was actually processing. He told her, on a cold afternoon when they were both working in the barn and the children were at the school in town, about how he had built the house. He'd been 22, he said. Clara had drawn the floor plan herself on a piece of brown paper with a charcoal pencil, and he had built exactly what she drew, even the part that he thought was structurally questionable and had turned out to be fine. He told this story without the crushing grief that had accompanied any mention of Clara in the early weeks, and Dorothy recognized the shift, the movement from grief that obliterates to grief that coexists, which is where the healing actually lives. She had good instincts, Dorothy said. She did, he said. Then, after a moment, "You do too, different kind," but he seemed to realize he had said something that had a complicated shape to it. "Thank you," Dorothy said simply and let it alone. The thing that broke everything open the rest of the way happened on a Thursday in mid-December, when the temperature dropped so fast and so hard that the creek froze over in a single night, and Dorothy woke at 3 in the morning with the certain knowledge that the cattle needed to be moved to the covered portion of the barn. She was already pulling on her coat when she heard Gideon up and moving, and she came into the hallway and nearly walked into him in the dark, and they stood very close to each other in the narrow passage, both of them half-dressed and fully awake, and neither of them moved for a moment that stretched out longer than the cold night around them. "The cattle," she said. "No," he said. They went out together in the frozen dark and worked side by side for 2 hours in the barn, moving the cattle, checking the horses, laying extra straw, working in the wordless, efficient rhythm of people who have figured out how to occupy the same space without collision. At some point Dorothy's lantern went out and she stood in the dark for a moment before Gideon was simply there, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, tilting his lantern to relight hers. "Thank you," she said. He stood still for a moment, very close, and she could see his breath in the lantern light, and he could certainly see hers. "Dorothy," he said, and then said nothing else, just her name, and the way he said it was different from every other time he had said it before. She looked up at him. His face in the lantern light was open in a way she had not seen before, all the walls down, just for a moment, just this once. "I know," she said softly, because she did. He kissed her carefully, almost tentatively, the way a man does something for the first time that he suspects may be the most important thing he has ever done. Just once, just briefly, and then he stepped back and she could see him reassembling himself, putting the composure back in place out of old habit. She turned and went back to checking the straw, giving him the privacy of a moment to collect himself. She was smiling at the ground where he couldn't see her. Christmas was the turning point that nobody could have mistaken for anything else. Eliza had been quietly, industriously plotting a Christmas dinner for a week, and Dorothy had been helping her with it secretly, teaching her to make the dried apple pie that had been her own mother's recipe, letting her lead the process, because, Eliza needed to feel that she could do something for her family the way her mother had once done things, needed to feel the dignity of competence and contribution. Gideon did not know about any of this until Christmas morning, when he came downstairs to find the table set properly for the first time in a year, cloth on it, the good plates that had been in the back of the cupboard gathering dust, a bowl of pine branches in the center that Thomas had cut and Dorothy had shown him how to arrange. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at the table, and then looked at Dorothy, who was at the stove, and then looked at Eliza, who was standing very straight with her hands folded in front of her, watching him with that ancient, careful gaze. "I made the pie," Eliza told him. "Dorothy helped, but I did most of it." Gideon crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and crouched down to his daughter's level, and pulled her into his arms with a thoroughness that made Dorothy turn back to the stove very quickly on the pretext of checking something that didn't need checking, because the look on his face was too private to witness head-on. "It's wonderful," he said into Eliza's hair. "It's the most wonderful thing I've seen in a very long time." They ate together that morning, all 5 of them, and the warmth of it was the real kind. Not just the warmth from the stove, not just the warmth of food, but the warmth of people gathered around a table who are, slowly and imperfectly, and against all odds, becoming a family. After supper, after the children were in bed and the kitchen was clean, Gideon found Dorothy sitting near the fire with a cup of tea and a letter she had been putting off reading from her cousin in Missouri, whose handwriting she could recognize from across a room. "What is it?" he asked, sitting in the chair across from her. "A letter from my cousin," she said. "She's been unwell. She stopped. Worried about her. And about the store," she admitted. "I haven't been as attentive as I should be. She gestured a little helplessly at the house around them, the life around them. He was quiet for a moment. "You can't manage both forever," he said. It was not a criticism. He said it the way he said most important things, simply, without ornament. "I know," she said. "The store has a value," he said. "The building, the inventory. You could sell it if you wanted. Or hire someone to run it," or he stopped. "Or," she said. "Or keep it," he said. "Keep it exactly as it is. There's no reason to let it go if you don't want to." She looked at him. "You mean that?" "Of course I mean it," he said, with a touch of something that was almost offended. "I said it, didn't I?" She felt the warmth of it move through her, the simple, uncomplicating generosity of it. "Yes," she said, "you did." He reached out across the narrow space between their chairs, the same space she had crossed weeks ago, to put her hand over his and put his hand over hers. Left it there. "I'll be honest with you," he said. "It took me time to understand what you'd done, coming here, staying." "I know it did," she said. "I thought," he pressed on carefully. "I thought at first that it was pity, and then I thought it was duty. And then I couldn't work out what it was, because you didn't behave like a woman doing either of those things." "What did I behave like?" she asked. "Like a woman who saw something that needed doing and decided to do it," he said. "Like a woman who decided that we were worth—" He seemed to run out of sentence. "You were worth it," she said quietly. "All of you." His hand pressed slightly on hers. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "I don't want you to stay because the children need you," he said. "I need you to know that. I want you to stay because when I wake up in the morning and stand at the window, I'm not just looking at where the light comes up anymore. I'm thinking about what you said the night before, about whether you slept well, about—" He stopped himself with the abrupt frustration of a man who has never had to put these kinds of things into words before and is discovering that they are slippery and resistant. "I'm not good at this," he said. "You're doing fine," she said. "Clara and I," he began, and she made no movement, no flinch, and he pressed on. "Clara and I never had to say much. We grew up together. Things were understood. This is—" he looked at her. "This is different." "Is different bad?" she asked. He shook his head slowly. "No," he said. He seemed to find something, some bottom of the thought. "It's like learning to walk after you've been walking a different way your whole life. The mechanics are different, but the destination can be the same." Dorothy looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the wind came down off the mountains and wrapped around the house, and the fire moved and the house held still. "I feel the same way," she said. if you were wondering." He turned her hand over under his and held it properly, and they stayed that way through the rest of the evening, reading in companionable silence, close enough to the fire that the cold at the edges of the room felt very far away. January brought a problem that Dorothy had not anticipated in any of the calculations she had made when she'd agreed to this life. A man named Harlan Voss rode into Harlow Creek on a gray afternoon and presented himself at the sheriff's office with a claim that turned out to be aimed directly at the Langston farm. Harlan Voss was a land speculator, the worst kind, the kind who appeared in struggling communities with legal papers and bright smiles, and left behind them the wreckage of people who had not understood what they were signing. He had, he said, a contract signed by Gideon Langston in the dark autumn following Clara's death, a contract for the sale of the east 40 acres of the Langston farm at a price that was, by January, worth a quarter of what the land had risen to following the announcement that the railroad was planning a spur line that would pass through Harlow Creek. Dorothy found out about it from the sheriff, who came to the store on the pretense of buying coffee and told her in a low voice that smelled of genuine concern. She went home and found Gideon in the barn and told him directly, because she had promised herself and him that she would not tiptoe around important things. He went still in the way he went still when something hit him somewhere deep and serious. "I signed it," he said, after a long silence. "Back in September. I don't know that I read it properly. He stopped. "You were not in a condition to be signing anything," she said. "No," he said, "I wasn't." The silence between them was taut and uncomfortable in a way that their silences hadn't been for some weeks. She could feel him rebuilding walls somewhere behind his eyes, retreating into the posture of a man who has been stupid and knows it and is bracing himself for the accompanying judgment. She did not give him the judgment. "I want to see the contract," she said, "before anything else." He looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. "I keep books for a living," she said. "And my father had a lawyer friend in Denver who taught me enough about contracts to know which ones will hold and which ones have cracks in them. Let me see it first." He went to the house and came back with the document from the strongbox under the bedroom floorboard, and she spread it on a clean section of the workbench and read it very carefully by lantern light while he stood at her shoulder. It took her 20 minutes. She read it twice. "This is fraudulent," she said when she was done. "What?" "The witness signatures," she said, pointing. "This one here, Aldous Prentice. Was the sheriff there when you signed this?" A long pause. "No," he said slowly. "Voss said the witnesses could sign later, that it was just a formality." "It is not a formality," she said. "A notarized contract in the state of Colorado requires witnesses present at the signing. These signatures were added after. Look at the ink, it's a slightly different shade. And this line here," she pointed again. "The legal description of the property uses a boundary mark that hasn't existed since your grandfather's time. The survey from 1872 changed it. This contract references a marker that predates the legal description of this land as your title holds it. That's not a technicality, Gideon. That's a fundamental defect." He stared at the paper. Then he looked at her. "You're certain?" "I'm certain enough that I want to take this to a lawyer in Denver before Voss has time to do anything with it," she said. "And I want to talk to Aldous about his forged signature." The sheriff, when confronted with the document, went a particular shade of red that Dorothy had never seen on a human face before. He had not signed anything. He had never met Harlan Voss. He was furious in the quiet, methodical way that made him an excellent lawman. And by the end of the week, Harlan Voss had left Harlow Creek considerably faster than he had arrived, under the understanding that the sheriff's next communication on the matter would be to the territorial marshal's office. The contract was void. The East 40 was safe. Gideon said very little about any of it during the process. He let Dorothy lead it, let her talk to the sheriff, write the letters, make the arguments with a watchful, careful attention that she initially interpreted as distance but later recognized as something else entirely. The night after the sheriff informed them that Voss had left the county and the matter was closed, they were at supper, and after the children were in bed Gideon said, "Can I tell you something?" "Always," she said. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what it would have been like if you hadn't come." He said it looking at the table between them, not at her. "If Prentice hadn't come to you, if you'd said no." She waited. "The children would have been taken in by the pastor's family," he said, "which is a good family. They would have been fine." A pause. "I don't know what I would have been." "You would have come back to yourself eventually," she said. "People generally do." "I don't know that," he said. "I was very far gone." He looked up at her. "You saved the East 40, and you've been there. Have been a lot of things, but that one." He stopped, tried again. "I might have lost the farm, the whole thing. I was in no condition to have caught that." "You would have found it eventually," she said. "Maybe," he said, "maybe not." He held her gaze with an intensity that had become familiar to her but still produced an effect she had not found a way to be indifferent to. "I want you to know I see it. Everything. I know I don't say it the right way. I know I'm not Gideon," she said. "What? You're doing it again," she said. "Doing what?" "Apologizing for who you are," she said. "You don't have to. I know who you are." Something very simple moved across his face. Something that was, she realized with a start, relief. "I think I might be falling in love with you," he said. The way he said it was so quiet and so careful, like setting down something breakable, that it took her a full 3 seconds to absorb it. She felt it move through her completely, not like a surprise exactly, but like something she had been suspecting for weeks that she had not allowed herself to examine too directly for fear of what she would find. "I think the feeling might be mutual," she said. He let out a slow breath. Then, "That's terrifying." "Tremendously," she agreed. And she reached across the table, and he met her halfway, and they stayed like that while the fire burned and the winter settled itself around the house, and outside the stars were very clear and very cold, and the world felt both enormous and very small, the way it does when you are exactly where you are supposed to be. February came, and with it a softening, not of the weather, which was still hard and cold, but of everything between them. Gideon was not a demonstrative man by nature or by habit, and Dorothy did not need him to be, but there were small things that accumulated with the weight of large ones. The way he touched the back of her hand when he passed her in the kitchen. The way he stood close when they worked together, closer than strictly necessary. The way he had, without discussion or announcement, stopped standing at the window alone in the mornings. She would sometimes find him at the table instead, drinking coffee he had made himself, and he would look up when she came in with an expression that was entirely unguarded and had something in it that she was no longer afraid to recognize as gladness. She sold the general store in February. It was her own decision, made carefully over the course of 3 weeks of deliberation, and she told Gideon about it after the deed was done rather than before, because she wanted it to be her own choice and not a response to anything he might say. She sold it to the Henderson family's eldest son, who had wanted to open a proper mercantile for 3 years and had the capital now that the railroad spur had driven land prices up. She got a fair price. She put the money in the bank in her own name. When she told Gideon, he was quiet for a moment. "Are you sure?" he said. "Yes," she said. "You'll miss it," he said. He wasn't wrong. "I'll find something else to do with my hands," she said. "I always have." He looked at her for a long moment. "What made you decide?" She thought about how to answer this honestly. "I realized," she said, "that I wasn't selling it because I had to or because anyone asked me to. I was selling it because this," she meant the house, the farm, the children, him. She didn't say all of it, but he heard it. "This is what I want to be tending," she said. He came around the table to her side, deliberate, unhurried, and took her face in both his hands, which she had not expected, and looked at her for a moment before he kissed her with something in it that was entirely new, something she had not seen from him before. It was not the careful, tentative quality of their first kiss in the barn. This was a man who knew what he wanted and was not apologizing for it. She kissed him back with equal conviction. Spring arrived in March with the particular violence of high country springs, everything happening at once, snow and green shoots and mud and bird noise and the creek running high and hard with melt. The farm came back to life around them with a speed that felt almost personal, as though the land itself had been waiting for someone to look after it properly. Dorothy planted the kitchen garden herself, a serious garden this time, not just survival planting, with rows of beans and squash and corn, and the herbs she had brought from her late father's store in seed packets she'd kept for years. Gideon fixed the east fence properly, every post, in a single concentrated week of work that left him tired and satisfied in a way she had come to recognize as his best kind of tired. Thomas helped and asked the questions he always asked, and Gideon answered them all. And Dorothy watched from the garden and thought about how a child who is shown how to do things by his father is being given something that cannot be purchased at any price. The Reverend's wife, who had spent the winter in a state of reserved judgment about the whole arrangement and the unseemly speed of it, came to call in April and stayed 3 hours and left converted. Dorothy heard later that she had told 3 women at the church that the Langston farm was the most hopeful place she had visited in years, and that the children looked better than she had dared hope, and that Gideon Langston was, if she was not mistaken, smiling again. He was. Not constantly, not easily, not without the shadow that lived behind it, but genuinely, and in the way that means it is new rather than habitual, which is actually the better kind. There were still difficult days. Grief does not cure itself completely and does not observe schedules. There were still mornings when Gideon was somewhere else behind his eyes, and evenings when something would catch him off guard, a smell, a sound, the way the light hit something at a certain angle, and he would go silent and far away for a while. Dorothy learned to sit with him through those moments, without demanding he return from them on her timeline. She would simply be there nearby, doing something with her hands, available without being intrusive. She told him once, on one such evening, about her mother, about the marriage that had swallowed her mother whole, made her smaller every year until she was barely there. About how she had watched that happen and decided very young that she would not let it happen to her. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she valued most about him. "Is that what you were afraid of?" he asked when she was done. When Prentice first asked, "Partly," she said, "and partly I had never wanted something enough to risk it. Does that make sense?" "Yes," he said. Then, "What changed?" She considered this. "An 8-year-old girl with a baby on her hip," she said. "And a fence that needed fixing." He made a sound she had never heard him make before, a short, low, genuine laugh. Not the ghost of a laugh, the real thing. She looked at him in the firelight, this man who had been so thoroughly broken by love and loss and was putting himself back together one careful piece at a time, and she thought, with a completeness and a certainty she had not expected to ever feel about anyone, that she was entirely and irreversibly in love with him. She said so. She said it plainly, the way she said most things, while looking directly at him so there could be no ambiguity. "I love you," she said. "I'm not saying it so you'll say it back. I'm saying it because it's true, and because I don't believe in leaving true things unsaid." He looked at her with those dark, complicated eyes that she had spent 5 months learning to read. "I love you," he said back. "I believe I've been trying to say it properly for about 2 months. That was the right way," she said. "Was it?" "Exactly the right way," she said. May brought the first real evidence of the railroad spur, which arrived in the form of a survey team camping on the eastern edge of town and making everyone nervous with their transits and their notebooks. The Langston farm was well outside the path of the planned line, which was a relief, but the economic consequences of the railroad's arrival were already rippling outward. Land prices continued to rise. Harlow Creek was growing. 3 new families had arrived since January, and the town was beginning to feel like a place with a future rather than a place holding its breath. Dorothy was thinking about futures a great deal in May, for reasons that had become recently and concretely personal. She told Gideon on a Tuesday evening in late May. She had planned to tell him in a specific way, and then the moment came and all her planning dissolved, and she simply said it. "I think we're going to have a baby." He put down his coffee cup very carefully. "You think?" he said. "I'm fairly certain," she said. "I've been to see Dr. Walsh. He agrees." Gideon sat very still for a moment, and she watched him with the careful attention she always gave him during moments of processing, ready to give him whatever space or time he needed. He stood up from the table, walked around to her side, went down to one knee on the kitchen floor, not the way she had ever imagined a man going to a knee, not formal or performed, just economical and certain, and took both of her hands in his and looked up at her. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you feeling well?" The tenderness of the question, that the first thing was her well-being, not his reaction, not the logistics, not any of the complicated things, undid her more thoroughly than anything had in months. "I'm very well," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. He pressed her hands to his lips, both of them together, and held them there for a moment, and when he looked up again his eyes were bright in a way she had not seen. "Good," he said. Then, "Good." He didn't trust himself to more than the word, but she understood the complete content of what he meant by it, and she thought her heart might actually be too full to stay inside her chest. The summer was the best one she had ever known. She thought that often, the best summer, thought it with a simplicity and a gratitude that surprised her from herself, because she had never been a woman who used superlatives easily. The farm ran properly now, fully, and with real attention. Gideon had hired a hand, a young man named Abel Morris, 16 years old and from a struggling family outside town, who appeared at the farm one morning asking for work with the careful dignity of a boy who would rather die than beg, and was not quite hiding how hungry he was. Gideon hired him on the spot and told Dorothy about it that evening in a tone that made it clear he did not think it required justification, which meant he knew that it did not require justification, which was one of the things she loved about him. The cattle were thriving. The kitchen garden was producing more than they could use, and Dorothy had begun putting up preserves with Eliza's active and dedicated assistance, and the rows of sealed jars on the pantry shelves filled Dorothy with a satisfaction she recognized as something her grandmother would have understood perfectly. Thomas had planted 2 rows of corn that were his specific project, and his pride was immense and completely warranted. Ruth was walking with full confidence now and had opinions about everything, which she communicated with a forcefulness that made all of them laugh regularly. She had Clara's dark hair and Gideon's brown eyes, and she had taken to Dorothy with the wholehearted trust of a child too young to have learned to guard her heart, which Dorothy counted as one of the great gifts of her life. She told Gideon this one evening that Ruth was a gift specifically. He looked at her and said, "They all are, and so are you." She had been reaching for something on the high kitchen shelf when he said it, and she stayed with her back to him for a moment longer than necessary, composing herself. Then she turned around. "You're getting much better at this," she said. "I have a good teacher," he said, and went back to his boots, and she loved him so ferociously in that moment that she almost couldn't breathe from it. August arrived, and with it, a letter from Dorothy's cousin Alina in Missouri, who was now recovered from her illness, and writing with the breathless detail of a woman who had been too ill to write for months and had a great deal of stored-up news. She wrote about her family, her neighbors, her garden, the news from St. Louis. She wrote at the end, with the careful phrasing of someone who had been composing it for several drafts. "I confess I was worried when I heard of your arrangement. It seemed rushed and strange and not like you. But from your letters this winter and spring you sound so like yourself, only more so. Is that possible? I hope that man knows what he has." Dorothy read this letter at the kitchen table while supper was in the oven, and then she read it again. Gideon came in from the barn, washed his hands at the basin, looked at her over his shoulder. "Good news." "My cousin says she hopes you know what you have," Dorothy said. He dried his hands and came to stand behind her chair and bent down and put his chin on the top of her head, an uncalculated and domestic and entirely perfect gesture. "I know exactly what I have," he said. She folded the letter and set it aside and reached up to put her hand against his cheek, and they stayed like that for a moment in the warm kitchen that smelled like supper cooking, like canned peaches and dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams, like everything that had been let go and carefully retrieved. Their son was born in November, the same month they had married, which seemed, as the pastor's wife said, like a beautiful circle, and Gideon named him James, which was his own father's name and his grandfather's before that, a name with weight and history, and Dorothy agreed to it immediately, and completely, because she understood the gravity with which he offered it. James Langston arrived loudly and emphatically, in contrast to the quiet deliberation of his father, and announced his opinions on the matter with such force that Dr. Walsh said he had a future in politics. Ruth was fascinated by him in the careful, assessing way she assessed all new things. Thomas was solemn and proud, and within a week had appointed himself the baby's primary protector with a seriousness that was genuinely touching. Eliza held James the first time and looked at him for a long time with an expression that was complex and private, and then she looked at Dorothy, and Dorothy nodded once, which was all that either of them needed. Gideon held his son that first evening with the particular stillness of a man who is understanding something for the first time, not about babies. He had held babies before, but about something else, about continuation, about the way life moves forward through the people who are brave enough to keep living it. He looked up at Dorothy from the chair where he was sitting with James, and his face was entirely open all the way through, nothing held back. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. "We did that together." He smiled, full and real and without the shadow, for exactly this one moment, the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Winter settled in again, their second winter, and it was entirely different from the first. The house was warmer. Gideon had spent October recaulking every window and reinforcing the insulation in the walls, and the result was a house that held its heat like it meant it. The wood was stacked 4 feet high on the porch. The pantry was full. The livestock were settled and tended. They sat by the fire in the evenings, she and Gideon, the children asleep, James in the cradle nearby, and they talked. They had become people who talked, which was a thing Dorothy had required and Gideon had agreed to, and which had become, over the course of 12 months, something he sought as actively as she did. He told her things he had not told anyone. About the fear that had lived in him through Clara's illness, the helpless, devouring fear of watching someone leave and not being able to stop it. About the guilt that had followed, irrational but immovable, the conviction of a grieving man that he should have been able to do something. About the months after, the dark, terrible months, when he had stopped being able to feel anything that felt like it was worth the effort of feeling. She listened to all of it. She did not try to resolve it or explain it away or make it smaller. She just listened and asked questions and was there. She told him in turn about the loneliness that had lived under her competence for years, the loneliness of being capable in a way that made people assume you didn't need anything, didn't want anything, were fine in your solitary sufficiency, about the way she had almost grown used to it, about the 8-year-old girl with the baby on her hip who had looked at her in the doorway and shown her, without a word, what it was she had been walking past for years without seeing. He took her hand in the firelight and held it the way he held things he valued, with care and intention and without unconscious gripping. "You were lonely," he said. "I was," she said. "I didn't know that," he said. "When you first came, I thought, I know what you thought," she said. "I thought the same things about myself." "What changed your mind?" "You," she said, "and the children and the fence." He laughed, the real laugh again, easy now, coming more often, settling into his face the way all the things she had hoped for had slowly settled. "The fence," he said. "The fence," she confirmed. "That's the most Dorothy Hart thing I have ever heard," he said. She raised her eyebrows. "You know, it's entirely possible that I am the most Dorothy Hart thing you've ever heard." He looked at her with the full warmth of his eyes, which she was still not entirely accustomed to after all these months, because it still had the quality of something rare and therefore worth noticing. "That is absolutely true," he said. January of their second year brought a request from Abel Morris, their young farm hand, who came to them one morning with his hat in his hands to say that his family had been struggling since his father's injury in the fall had kept him from working, and that he wanted to ask if there was any way to take on more hours or different responsibilities in exchange for some kind of arrangement that might help them get through the winter. Gideon listened to this carefully. Then he said, "Is your father healing?" Abel said he was, slowly. Gideon said, "Tell your family to come for supper on Sunday." Abel looked up with an expression that contained equal measures of surprise and gratitude and the careful pride of a boy who had not wanted to be seen asking. "I mean it," Gideon said. "Sunday supper, all of you." Dorothy, who had been standing at the kitchen doorway during this exchange, caught Gideon's eye over Abel's head and said nothing. She went back to what she was doing at the stove, which happened to be making a large pot of chili, and she added more to it. The Morris family came on Sunday, Abel's father with his arm still in a sling, his mother with the carefully composed dignity of a woman in a hard situation, and 4 younger children who arranged themselves in the doorway with the wide-eyed wariness of children unused to strange houses. Ruth, who had no concept of wariness, walked immediately up to the youngest Morris child and announced her own name, and then held out a wooden horse that she had been carrying, which was her most prized possession. The Morris child took it carefully and handed it back and said his own name, which was Joseph, and Ruth apparently found this satisfactory, because she took Joseph's hand and dragged him into the front room to show him things. Dorothy watched this from the kitchen and felt something enormous and simple open up in her chest. Gideon spoke quietly with Abel's father for a long time after supper, in the way that men who understand physical work and the dignity of doing it speak to each other. And what came out of the conversation was an arrangement. Gideon would front the Morris family the cost of the lumber to make a repair to their property in exchange for a summer's worth of labor at a fair rate, which would clear the debt and leave the Morris family with a repaired property without the crushing weight of charity. Abel's mother thanked Dorothy in the kitchen with the careful thoroughness of a woman who wants to be sure the thanks is received, and Dorothy said simply, "Your son is a good worker and a good young man. It's been our pleasure." After they left, Gideon sat at the table and Dorothy put 2 cups of coffee down and sat across from him. "That was well done," she said. He shrugged with the slight discomfort of a man not practiced at receiving acknowledgement for acts of decency. "It was the right thing," he said. "A lot of people know what the right thing is and don't do it," she said. He looked at her. "You have an irritating habit of saying things that are true when I'm trying to be modest." "I'll try to be less accurate," she said. Another laugh. She collected them the way some women collected pressed flowers. Spring came for the second time, and it was everything the first spring had been and fuller. James was trying to pull himself upright on every available surface and regarding the world with the focused intensity of a boy who expects it to hold still while he examines it. Ruth had developed a specific fondness for Thomas that expressed itself as following him everywhere he went and offering him her assessment of what he was doing, which Thomas bore with admirable patience. Eliza was 10 now and had a gravity and a competence about her that made strangers assume she was older, and she had her father's eyes and her mother's, Clara's, way of moving through a room with quiet certainty. Dorothy watched Eliza sometimes and thought about what it means to tend to a person, not the cooking and the mending, though those things matter. The larger tending, the kind that says, "I see you, I believe in the specific person you are, I will be here when things are hard and when they are not, and the constancy of my presence is itself a form of love." She thought she understood now what the title of her life here meant. Not just the warm meals, though those had mattered. They had mattered enormously as a starting point, as the visible evidence of care in a house that had stopped being cared for. But the warm meals had been the door. Everything else she had been tending was behind it. The children who needed a grown woman to show them how to become themselves. The farm that needed someone to see what it could be and work toward it. the man who had been so thoroughly swallowed by grief that he had stopped knowing how to tend to himself, and who needed not fixing, because he was not broken in any way that was not entirely understandable, but someone to sit with him inside his life and show him by example that the life was still worth inhabiting. That was what she had done. That was what love, at its most functional and most true, looked like. Not the grand gesture, but the daily one. The fence post reset. The fire banked properly, the supper on the table, the hand held in the firelight. The presence, constant and genuine, that says without words, I am here, and I intend to keep being here, and that is the only promise worth making. She was thinking all of this one morning in early April when Gideon came up behind her in the kitchen and put both arms around her from behind and stood there, his chin on her shoulder, looking out the window at the spring morning. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," she said. "Narrow it down," he said. "Tending things," she said. "How that's what this is. What we are." A pause, his arms adjusted, settling more completely. "That's a good word for it," he said. "I thought so," she said. "You're always thinking," he said. "I used to find it unsettling." "Used to," she noted. "Now it just means you're going to say something I need to hear," he said. She turned in his arms, which required some negotiation given the practicalities of where they were standing and the fact that she was still holding a coffee cup, and looked up at him. "I love you, Gideon Langston," she said. "I love you more this spring than I did last spring, and I expect by next spring it will be more again, and that seems to me like an excellent trajectory." He looked at her with those eyes, warm and deep and entirely present here all the way through. "It's a very good trajectory," he said. He kissed her in the kitchen in the morning light properly, with the ease of a man who has stopped apologizing for wanting things. And outside the spring came on fast and green, and the creek ran full, and the horses moved in the pasture, and Ruth could be heard in the other room explaining something at length to James, who was listening with the focused attention of a 7-month-old, who has decided that this person is important. They had a good summer and a full autumn, and when the 2nd November came around, it brought with it a quiet anniversary that neither of them had marked aloud, but both of them were aware of, felt it in the way the day moved, in the slight altered quality of the morning. That evening, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Gideon set a wildflower on the kitchen table, a late-season dried one, found somewhere he hadn't told her, beautiful in the specific way that dried things are beautiful, preserved rather than fresh. He set it on the table and didn't explain it. She understood. This was not her tribute. This was his to Clara, to the first life, to everything that had come before and made this possible, because the before is part of the now and cannot be separated from it without lying about what a life actually is. She sat beside him at the table and they were quiet together for a while. Then he said, "I want you to know that what I have with you, what this is, it doesn't diminish anything. It's not instead of, it's," he thought for a moment. "It's how life actually works, if you're lucky." "I know," she said. "I've never thought otherwise." "I know you haven't," he said. "That's one of the things." He looked at her. "One of the many." She put her hand over his on the table. "One of the many," she agreed. They sat together in the kitchen of the house he had built, and she had come to tend in the year 1879 in Harlow Creek, Colorado, with 3 children asleep upstairs and one asleep in the cradle at the edge of the firelight, and the farm solid around them in the cold, clear dark, the cattle settled, the horses warm, the garden waiting under frost for another spring. Everything that had been let go was tended again. Everything that had stopped was moving again. The meals were warm, the house was warm. The man who had stood at his window alone every morning now stood at it with her sometimes, watching the light come up together, not needing to say anything about it because some things are complete in the doing. He had not smiled in 8 months when she arrived. He smiled nearly every day now. She counted this not as her accomplishment but as his, as evidence of the man he had always been, recovered from under the weight of his grief by the combined effort of his own slow bravery and the proximity of someone who believed, without question and without agenda, that the work was worth doing. She had not been looking for love when she came to this farm. She had not been looking for anything except something that needed doing. She had found considerably more than that. She had found the particular and irreplaceable thing that is built not from romance but from the daily commitment to show up and tend to what needs tending, and the discovery, which surprised her still sometimes in its depth, that showing up and tending is, in the end, exactly what love is made of. The second winter passed and gave way to the third spring, and Dorothy found herself in the kitchen garden on a warm April morning, James on a blanket in the sun nearby, Ruth beside her asking questions about why carrots grow the way they do and whether worms are important, Thomas in the field beyond helping Abel Morris repair a section of fence that the winter had shifted, and Eliza at the well with a bucket looking exactly like the young woman she was becoming, steady and capable and sure of herself, in a way that made Dorothy's chest ache with something that was purely and simply joy. Gideon came across the yard from the barn and stopped at the edge of the garden and stood with his thumbs in his belt and looked at all of it, the children in their various projects, the garden taking its spring shape, Dorothy on her knees in the dirt with her sleeves rolled and her hair coming loose from its pins. She looked up and found him watching her. "What?" she said. He shook his head slowly, but he was smiling. The full, real, practiced, and easy smile that lived on his face now like it belonged there, like it had always been meant to live there and had simply been waiting. "Nothing," he said. "Nothing," she repeated, skeptical. "Everything," he said. "I was thinking everything." She sat back on her heels and looked at him in the spring morning, this man who had been so lost when she found him, this man who had let her stay, this man who had fought his way back from the darkest place he had ever been, and was standing in a yard full of growing things and children and life with a look on his face that was the simplest and most complete expression of gratitude she had ever seen on a human being. "Good," she said. "That's the right thing to be thinking." He came through the garden gate and crouched beside her in the dirt, entirely without concern for his clothes, and helped her with the planting. They worked side by side in the spring morning, their hands in the soil, the children busy around them, the farm alive in every direction, the creek running full somewhere beyond the east pasture, the mountains on the horizon holding the sky up the way they had always held it, steady and enormous and indifferent to the small particular miracle taking place in the garden below. This was what had been saved. Not just the farm, though the farm mattered, its 300 acres and its proper fences and its full pantry and its herd of well-tended cattle. Not just the children, though Eliza and Thomas and Ruth and James were perhaps the most important living evidence of everything that tending makes possible. What had been saved was a man's capacity to be present in his own life. What had been found was a woman's knowledge of what she wanted that life to look like. What had been built between them, slowly and imperfectly and with all the genuine difficulty of two people who came to each other from completely different histories, was the real and durable thing, the thing that holds through winters and hard seasons and does not require a grand declaration to know itself, because it announces itself every morning in the simple fact of continuing. He had not eaten a warm meal since his wife passed. She had fixed that. And everything else he had stopped tending, she had helped him tend again. And he had returned the favor in the ways that mattered most by seeing her clearly, by staying present, by being the kind of man who crouches in the dirt to help with the planting because the work is there and his hands are capable and the person beside him is worth any effort. That was the whole of it, and it was more than enough. It was, in every way that counted, everything.